Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Military Reconstruction Acts. Now, this is a very important part of of Reconstruction. All right, and usually this ushered in what is known as radical Reconstruction or Congressional Reconstruction, and Congress, over Johnson's vetoes, passed what's known as the Military Reconstruction Acts. This is a series of acts that basically, I mean, it did a lot of things, but one of the most important things that it did was that it politically disenfranchised former Confederates in the South, or in the in the Confederacy. This meant that most white men in the South would not be able to vote. And another thing that it did, and I don't have it on the PowerPoint here, is that it divided the South into different military districts. And Louisiana and Texas was one district, and it was, basically the Union occupied the former Confederacy. Now, because former Confederates were politically disenfranchised, what this means is that they couldn't vote. This gave rise to the Ku Klux Klan in Pulaski, Tennessee, which started off as an organization to scare African Americans, right, former slaves, and of course there was men. It was not over 21 years of age or older. It wasn't women didn't have the right to vote yet. From voting, they were the ones that were now politically enfranchised. So basically, you had former slaves that could vote in the South, and you have former Confederates, most of whom, well, they were white, all right, could not vote. And so the KKK, they put on their sheets and they rode out through the countryside. This was, supposed to signify ghosts of the Confederacy. And at the beginning, they were used just, they were trying to intimidate former slaves from voting. But it did become very violent, and it didn't take long for that for them to become violent. So, and this was known as, again, the Military Reconstruction Acts, and your textbook goes into more detail, and it's a very important part of Reconstruction. And usually, when people talk about Reconstruction, this is the time period uh, that they focus a lot on. Now, Johnson, was hated. All right. I mean, they really didn't like this guy. And so Congress passed what's known as the Tenure of Office Act. This is something that may be on your test. It's a good idea to take a look at this further. The Tenure of Office Act was really kind of a ridiculous act, and it was just passed so that Johnson could they knew Johnson would violate this act, and so then they could impeach Johnson. What the Tenure of Office Act stated was that Johnson would not be able to fire anyone in his cabinet without congressional approval. And, again, this is something that was ridiculous. And, of course, Johnson being a hardhead, that's one of the first things that he did once the act was passed, and they put Johnson on trial. Now, Johnson was impeached. Now, this is something that you need to understand. There's a difference, between impeachment and removal from office. All right, impeachment is kind of like an indictment. Okay, so they voted to impeach him, but then he's put on trial in front of Congress. All right. So the House of Representatives ended up impeaching Johnson by a vote of 126 to 47. All right, and so once this happens, you have to go on trial, and they failed to convict Johnson. Now, what happens is you kind of go on trial in front of the Senate. So they failed to remove Johnson from office. Now, the only other president in our history was President Clinton. to be impeached. Now, some people say Nixon, and you can actually see find on the internet some places they'll put Nixon as being impeached, but Nixon really, well, Nixon resigned before he was impeached, but he was undergoing the impeachment process, so he's kind of like in between. All right, Johnson was impeached, but he was not removed from office. I hope I made that clear. I never do a great job of explaining that. But that is something that you need to know. We're not going to get into the reasons why Clinton was impeached. That's a different story. So in the election of 1868 and 1872, Ulysses S. Grant won the election in 1862 and won the election again in 1872. He beat Horatio Seymour. Grant was a Republican, by the way. One of the major issues that you'll see later on, Horatio Seymour wanted what they called cheap money. It was basically a way to print money. What you'll see later on is people wanted to move from the gold standard to what's known as bimetallism, to also use silver so that there would be more money in the system. Now, of course, when you have more money, this causes inflation. But some people argue that this is not always necessarily a bad thing because they argue that it helps people that are in debt. If you owe the bank $50,000 and then all of a sudden they start printing money and you have a fixed interest rate, then that $50,000 doesn't seem as much anymore. Anyway, Grant beat Seymour fairly easily, and even though his administration, he wasn't corrupt, but his administration was somewhat corrupt. Regardless of this, he ended up winning the election of 1872. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is the Amnesty Act of 1872. And we will discuss that in the next lecture.